It was a humid night in Bangkok, Thailand, as I prepared for another long shift at the Sathorn General Hospital. The city's relentless heat had eased somewhat with the setting sun, but the oppressive humidity lingered, weighing on me like a wet blanket. As I donned my crisp white nurse's uniform, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settling over the hospital, a feeling that had become all too familiar during my night shifts. My name is Thawat, and I am a male nurse working in this sprawling medical institution. Each night, I step into a world of beeping monitors, hushed conversations, and the ever-present scent of antiseptic. It's a world that offers solace to some and despair to others, and I navigate its corridors with a blend of compassion and detachment that has become second nature to me. The night shift was never easy, but it carried a peculiar aura, an eerie stillness that whispered of secrets hidden in the shadows. Colleagues came and went, sharing stories of inexplicable occurrences that would send shivers down your spine. I had scoffed at such tales, dismissing them as the product of overactive imaginations, until one night my perception of reality would be forever altered. As I made my way through the dimly lit corridors of the hospital, the fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows on the sterile walls. The hospital seemed to hold its breath, as if it were an entity unto itself, waiting for something to happen. The occasional soft chatter of the night staff echoed through the hallways, accompanied by the distant hum of medical equipment. My co-worker, Nock, a friendly and experienced nurse, greeted me as I entered the ward. Her smile was a small beacon of warmth in the otherwise cold and sterile environment. "It's going to be a quiet night, I hope." I returned the greeting with a nod, the words sticking in my throat as the sense of unease intensified. "Sawazdee-ka, Nock." "Let's hope for a peaceful night," I replied, though my voice betrayed my apprehension. The ward was mostly empty except for a few patients in their beds, their shallow breaths breaking the silence. I approached each bed, checking vital signs and administering medications as needed. The patients were mostly elderly, their frail bodies bearing the weight of age and illness. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for them, trapped in this sterile, lifeless environment. As I moved from bed to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It was as if the very walls of the hospital were whispering secrets I couldn't decipher. I brushed it off as exhaustion, a side effect of the long hours and the ever-present sense of foreboding that hung in the air. Hours passed and the night wore on. Nock and I exchanged occasional banter to keep our spirits up, but the tension in the air was palpable. The hospital remained quiet, almost too quiet for a place that never truly slept. It was then that the first inkling of the strange events that would unfold that night emerged. As I checked on an elderly patient, Mrs. Anong, she suddenly stirred in her sleep, her frail hand reaching out to grasp mine with surprising strength. Her eyes, clouded with age, met mine, and in a voice trembling with fear, she whispered something in a language I couldn't quite identify. It was a dialect I hadn't encountered before, and her words were a mystery to me. Nock, who was more familiar with local dialects, approached us with a furrowed brow, her concern evident. She listened intently as Mrs. Anong continued to mutter incoherently. Then she turned to me, her expression grave. "Thawat, she's speaking in a dialect from a remote village in northern Thailand. I can understand bits and pieces, but it's mostly unintelligible. She keeps saying something about Nang Ma and Ekhamael, which roughly translate to she's here, and they have come." I exchanged a worried look with Nock, my heart quickening its pace. What could Mrs. Anong possibly mean? Was she delirious, or was there something more sinister at play? I had no answers, and the unease that had settled in my gut deepened. Little did I know that this cryptic message was just the beginning, a harbinger of the eerie and inexplicable events that would soon unfold in the silent ward of Sathorn General Hospital. Nock and I left Mrs. Anong's bedside, her unsettling words still echoing in our minds. We continued our rounds, checking on the other patients, but the sense of foreboding that had gripped me since the beginning of the shift had now intensified. As we moved from bed to bed, we couldn't help but notice a recurring pattern among the patients. Many of them seemed restless, tossing and turning in their sleep. Some whispered incomprehensible words, their voices trembling with fear. It was as if a dark presence loomed over the ward, casting a shadow over their dreams. I leaned over the bed of an elderly man named Mr. Somchai. He was mumbling in his sleep, his eyes darting beneath closed lids. His wrinkled face was etched with fear, and his frail hands clutched the sheets tightly. Nock and I exchanged glances, our concern growing. "It's happening again," Nock whispered in a hushed tone, as if afraid to disturb the fragile atmosphere. I nodded in agreement, my senses on high alert. "Something's not right, Nock. These patients, they all seem to be experiencing nightmares, and they keep talking about a shadowed presence." Nock's brow furrowed as she listened to the patients around us, all caught in the grip of restless slumber. "It's not just a coincidence, Thawat. There's something going on here, something we can't explain." As the night wore on, the whispers and nightmares continued, and the unease in the ward grew more tangible with each passing moment. The recurring theme of a shadowed presence weighed heavily on our minds, but we had no clues as to its origin or nature. Then, as if on cue, the lights in the ward began to flicker. A low, ominous hum filled the air, and a chill swept through the corridor. Nock and I exchanged alarmed glances, our hearts racing. The flickering lights cast eerie, irregular patterns on the walls, and the hospital's eerie silence was now punctuated by the unsettling sound of electrical malfunctions. It was as if the very building itself was responding to an unseen force, and the atmosphere grew thick with dread. And then, it happened. A whispered voice, guttural and haunting, began to emanate from the darkness. It was a voice like no other, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Its words were in a language that neither Nock nor I could identify, but its tone was unmistakably malevolent. Nock grabbed my arm, her fingers trembling. "Thawat, do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, unable to tear my gaze away from the sourceless voice that echoed through the ward. The words were incomprehensible, but their intent was clear. They were laced with malice, a promise of something sinister lurking in the shadows. The voice continued to whisper, growing louder and more insistent, as if it sought to invade our very souls. We couldn't understand its words, but its presence was suffocating, a malevolent force that seemed to feed on our fear. As the voice intensified, Nock and I exchanged another look, our resolve hardening. We couldn't ignore this any longer. We had to find the source of this unsettling phenomenon, no matter how deep it led us into the heart of darkness that had enveloped the silent ward of Sathorn General Hospital. Nock and I exchanged determined glances, our shared fear now mingled with a steely resolve. We couldn't let the voice, with its chilling and malevolent undertones, go unanswered. It was as if the very air in the ward had thickened, a tangible presence that pressed upon us, urging us to confront the unknown. With cautious steps, we followed the voice as it seemed to move through the corridor, leading us deeper into the heart of the hospital. The flickering lights cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an unsettling backdrop to our search for answers. The source of the voice, now distinct and insistent, led us to a door that stood alone at the end of a dimly lit hallway. The door appeared unremarkable, like any other in the hospital, but its presence was unnerving. It was as if the voice emanated from behind that door, beckoning us to unlock its secrets. Nock and I exchanged nervous glances, our hands trembling as we approached the door. The voice grew louder, its words more urgent, yet still in a language we couldn't comprehend. It was as if the door itself were alive, pulsating with an eerie energy that matched the rhythm of our racing hearts. We hesitated for a moment, the weight of our decision pressing upon us. But the voice's insistence pushed us forward, compelling us to unlock the door and venture into the unknown. With trembling hands, I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. Dust-covered medical equipment, long forgotten and untouched, filled the space. The air was stale, and a sense of abandonment hung heavy in the room. Nock and I exchanged perplexed glances. The room held no obvious answers, no clues as to the origin of the voice or the nature of the unsettling presence that had enveloped the ward. It was a dead end, a room frozen in time, devoid of life or meaning. Just as we were about to turn and leave, a sudden gust of wind rushed through the room, extinguishing the lanterns we had brought with us. Darkness engulfed us, and a wave of panic washed over Nock and me. Frantically, I fumbled for my phone and activated its flashlight. The harsh beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing something that sent a chill down my spine. In the pale glow of the flashlight, we saw them, shadowy figures contorted and twisted, resembling grotesque human shapes. They moved along the walls of the room, their movements unnatural and disjointed. Their faces, if one could call them that, were obscured by darkness, and yet their malevolence was palpable. The voice, once a whisper, had now become a cacophony of incomprehensible murmurs, each more sinister than the last. It was as if the very room itself had come alive, and the entities that now surrounded us were its malevolent guardians. Nock and I stumbled backward in terror, our hearts pounding in our chests. There was no escape, no way out of this nightmarish room. The entities closed in on us, their contorted forms advancing with a deliberate slowness that was more unsettling than if they had rushed us. The room seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and as the entities drew nearer, Nock and I clung to each other, our breaths ragged, our minds overwhelmed with fear. In that moment, it felt as though we had ventured into a nightmare from which there was no waking. The hospital, once a place of healing and solace, had become a nightmarish labyrinth, and we were trapped within its depths, at the mercy of an unidentified and malevolent entity that seemed beyond the realm of human comprehension. As the shadowy entities closed in, Nock and I were gripped by sheer terror. The room, once filled with the hum of medical equipment, had transformed into a haunting spectacle of twisted figures and unintelligible whispers. Our breaths came in shallow gasps, and our minds raced for a way out of this nightmarish predicament. With a trembling hand, I shone my flashlight in an attempt to ward off the advancing entities. The harsh beam of light seemed to repel them momentarily, causing them to retreat a few steps. It was our only defense in that surreal darkness, and we clung to it like a lifeline. Nock's voice quivered with fear as she spoke. "Thawat, we need to find a way out of here. This can't be real. It must be some kind of hallucination." I nodded in agreement, my heart pounding. "We have to go back the way we came. Maybe we can find the door again." As we cautiously backed away from the encroaching entities, we navigated through the pitch-black room, our flashlight carving a path through the shadows. The room seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the entities continued to murmur incomprehensibly, their malevolence undiminished. Just as we reached what we believed to be the door, a sudden and overwhelming darkness engulfed us. The flashlight's beam flickered and died, leaving us in utter blackness. Panic gripped us, and our hands groped blindly for a way out. In the inky blackness, we could hear the entities drawing closer, their presence palpable even without the visual confirmation. It was as if they had become one with the darkness itself, and our attempts to escape were futile. Nock's voice trembled in the darkness. "Thawat, I can't see anything. We're trapped." Fear threatened to consume us as we stood there, helpless and disoriented. It was a nightmare beyond imagination, a situation from which we saw no escape. But just as despair settled in, a blinding flash of light shattered the darkness. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn asunder, and we were bathed in an ethereal radiance that seared our eyes. The entities, caught in the blinding brilliance, dissipated into nothingness, their eerie whispers silenced. Nock and I shielded our eyes, disoriented and bewildered by the sudden change. When the light finally subsided, we found ourselves back in the abandoned room with the dusty medical equipment. The lanterns had rekindled, casting a soft, warm glow in the room. It was as if the horrifying ordeal had been a nightmarish vision, a fleeting glimpse into the unknown. Nock and I exchanged incredulous looks, our hearts still racing from the adrenaline of the encounter. We were back where we started, in the room that had seemed like a dead end. The entities, the darkness, and the whispers had vanished, leaving us with more questions than answers. Our breaths came in ragged sighs as we tried to make sense of what had just transpired. We couldn't deny what we had witnessed. The entities and their malevolent presence were real, but their sudden disappearance left us bewildered. Nock's voice trembled as she spoke, her words reflecting our shared confusion. "Thawat, what just happened? Are we still in the same hospital?" I shook my head, equally perplexed. "I don't know, Nock, but one thing is clear. We can't stay here. We need to return to the ward and find out if the others have experienced this too." With trepidation, we left the abandoned room and ventured back into the dimly lit corridors of the hospital. The lanterns cast long shadows on the walls, and the eerie silence persisted. As we made our way back to the ward, we couldn't help but wonder what other secrets this hospital held, and whether we would ever find answers to the enigma that had unfolded before our eyes. The night was far from over, and the unanswered questions weighed heavily on our minds. Whatever malevolent force had crossed our path that night was still a mystery, and we were determined to uncover the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be. Nock and I navigated our way back to the ward, our footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The sense of foreboding still hung in the air, but the hospital seemed eerily normal once more. The fluorescent lights bathed the corridor in their sterile glow, and the soft hum of medical equipment resumed. As we re-entered the ward, we were met with a sight that defied our expectations. The patients were sleeping peacefully in their beds, their breathing steady and untroubled. The unease that had permeated the ward had dissipated, and everything appeared as it should during a typical night shift. Nock and I exchanged bewildered glances, our minds struggling to reconcile the nightmarish encounter with the serene scene before us. It was as if the terrifying ordeal in the abandoned room had been a fleeting and inexplicable anomaly. Mrs. Anong, who had earlier whispered cryptic messages in a dialect from a remote village, now slept soundly, her face relaxed and untroubled. The other patients, who had experienced nightmares and restlessness, were now in a state of peaceful repose. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic and malevolent entities we had encountered, and we couldn't fathom how the hospital had returned to its normal state so abruptly. Had the entire ordeal been a shared hallucination, a product of our overworked minds? Nock cautiously approached Mrs. Anong's bedside and checked her vital signs, her expression one of bewilderment. "Thawat, look at this. Mrs. Anong's vitals are stable now, and there's no trace of the fear she displayed earlier." I followed suit, examining the other patients and confirming Nock's observation. It was as if the night's earlier disturbances had left no trace, and the patients were now resting peacefully, blissfully unaware of the surreal events that had transpired. The hospital staff continued their routines, seemingly unaffected by the inexplicable phenomena we had witnessed. Doctors made their rounds, nurses attended to their duties, and the night shift carried on as if nothing had happened. Nock and I exchanged incredulous glances once more, our shared experience leaving us with more questions than answers. Had it all been a shared delusion, a figment of our imagination brought on by exhaustion and stress? We attempted to communicate with our colleagues, sharing our harrowing experience in the abandoned room, but our efforts were met with skepticism and dismissive responses. The hospital staff regarded us with puzzled expressions, as if we were recounting a fantastical tale. One of the senior nurses, Sister Amara, approached us with a concerned expression. "Thawat Nok, I understand that night shifts can be challenging, but it's important to get enough rest. Your stories of malevolent entities and whispered voices, well, it sounds like exhaustion-induced hallucinations." Nok and I exchanged resigned glances, realizing that our attempts to seek validation or answers from our colleagues were in vain. The hospital staff's skepticism only deepened the mystery surrounding the events of that night. As the night shift continued, Nok and I couldn't shake the sense of disquiet that lingered within us. The patients were now resting peacefully, the ward seemingly devoid of the supernatural presence that had haunted us earlier. It was as if the hospital itself had erased all evidence of the inexplicable events. The lesson we had learned that night was simple yet profound. Sometimes there are things beyond our comprehension, mysteries that defy explanation. The hospital, with its sterile corridors and antiseptic scent, held its secrets close, and we could only hope that we would never cross paths with the unidentified and mysterious entity again. But as we made our way through the remainder of the night shift, a subtle and unsettling realization began to take hold. It was a realization that would serve as the final twist in our nightmarish tale. Amid the apparent return to normalcy, Nok and I began to notice subtle, unsettling changes in the patients. Mrs. Anong, who had been peaceful just moments before, now exhibited a distant, vacant expression. The other patients displayed similar symptoms, their eyes glazed and their movements listless. We exchanged alarmed glances as we continued to monitor the patients, our growing unease mirrored in each other's eyes. It was as if something had altered the very essence of these individuals, leaving them in a state of detachment from the world around them. As the night shift came to an end and the day staff arrived to take over, Nok and I struggled to make sense of the baffling turn of events. The hospital had seemingly returned to normal, but the patients now bore the marks of an inexplicable transformation. Our lesson that night was a haunting one, a reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, that the boundaries of reality can blur, and that the unknown can leave an indelible mark on those who venture too close. The hospital held its secrets, and as Nok and I left that morning, the uncertainty of what had truly transpired weighed heavily on our minds. We could only hope that the entity we had encountered would remain unidentified and mysterious, and that our paths would never cross again with the malevolent forces that lurked in the silent ward of Sathorn General Hospital. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and smash that like and bell notification icon to get notified every time I upload a new video. You can also check more of my horror stories right here.